Ezra Beaumont was 37 years old the Saturday morning a man he had never met stood in his own driveway, looked at the truck Ezra had been driving for 11 years, and laughed. To the people in Simone's life, her colleagues, her book club, the man she had been seeing for the better part of 8 months, Ezra was easy to understand. He worked in a machine shop on the south side of Memphis. He came home with grease under his nails that soap only partially resolved. He drove a 1969 Ford F-100 with a patched front quarter panel and a passenger side mirror held on by a single bolt, and the truck made a sound at idle that people tended to notice from a distance. He wore the same canvas jacket from October through March. He brought his lunch. He was, by every visible measure, a quiet and unremarkable man who had never given anyone cause to look twice. What the man in the driveway did not know, what Simone herself had never fully grasped, was that the F-100 was not simply old. It was the first vehicle Ezra's father, Raymond Beaumont, had ever fully restored from bare metal, completed in 1987 in a garage in North Memphis that had since become the foundation of Beaumont Fabrication and Restoration, a company with 7 employees, 3 active commercial contracts, and an annual revenue that had cleared $1.2 million for the 3rd consecutive year. The man laughed at the truck and said something to Simone that Ezra could not fully hear from across the yard, and Simone looked at the ground the way a person looks at the ground when they do not want to be associated with what is happening but do not intend to stop it. What neither of them understood, standing in the driveway of a house Ezra owned outright, was that the truck was the beginning of everything they had not bothered to see. The laugh would cost them both more than they could currently calculate. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Saturday mornings had a particular quality in that house that Ezra had always valued, and had never fully been able to explain to anyone who asked, because it was the kind of thing that lived in sensation rather than description. The neighborhood was old enough that the trees had grown past the roof lines. Elms and white oaks, planted decades before any of the current residents had arrived, rooted deep enough now that the city's periodic storms bent them without breaking them. The light that came through the kitchen window in the morning had to pass through that canopy before it reached the table, and by the time it arrived, it had been softened and filtered into something that felt less like illumination and more like permission. Permission to be still for a moment before the day asked for anything. He had bought the house 6 years ago with cash from a contract his father's company had completed for a manufacturing facility in Bartlett, a full interior restoration of a converted warehouse space, 6 months of steady work that had paid accordingly. He had spent the first 2 summers doing the house's own restoration work himself, largely alone, on weekends and evenings, refinished heart pine floors that had been covered by linoleum since the 1970s, rebuilt the front porch where 3 joists had softened with age, repointed the chimney stack 1 course of brick at a time using a mix he'd learned from an old mason who had worked for his father's shop years before. There was not a corner of that house he had not put his hands on. He knew its sounds and its resistances the way a man knows something he has repaired himself, not from the outside, but from having been inside it. The F-100 sat in the driveway where it always sat, its presence more familiar to him than furniture. His father had started the truck's restoration the year Ezra was born and finished it the year Ezra turned 4, which meant that for as long as Ezra had any memory at all, that truck had been part of what the word home felt like. Raymond Beaumont had taught him to drive in the parking lot of a church on Valentine Avenue using that truck, patient in a way that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with understanding that some things could not be rushed without consequence. He had taught him to set ignition timing, to read a torque spec, to understand why you never rushed a gasket, because a failure that could have been prevented was not a mechanical problem, it was a character problem. He had said, more than once, "Ezra, the work you do on the front end determines everything else." He had not only been talking about engines. Raymond Beaumont had died 4 years ago, quietly, of the kind of slow illness that gives a man time to arrange his affairs, which Raymond had done with characteristic precision and without drama. He had left the company to Ezra and his older brother Dion, with operational management falling to Ezra, who had been running the floor since he was 26. He had left the F-100 specifically and separately, listed by name in a line of the will that read simply, "The 1969 Ford F-100, to Ezra. He'll know why." He knew why. The truck was not a vehicle. It was a proof of concept. It was his father's demonstration, made in steel and patience, that a man with good hands and a clear idea could take something discarded and make it into something that lasted. Everything that came after, the shop, the contracts, the employees, the accounts, had grown from the same root. You started with one true thing, and you built from it. You did not skip steps. Ezra had kept the truck running, not because it was practical, but because maintaining it was the closest thing he had to a conversation with his father that was still available to him. He changed the oil on schedule. He kept the brakes right. He replaced the weather stripping on the doors the previous spring because the seal had gone soft. The truck was not a monument. It was a living thing. That was the difference. He had been 29 when he met Simone at a mutual friend's dinner party in Midtown. She had been quick and bright, and certain of herself in a way he had found appealing, and she had laughed at something he said, something dry and understated, the kind of thing that required actual listening to catch. And that had mattered to him. Most people didn't listen closely enough. They had married 18 months later in a ceremony at a venue on the river. 50 people, no band, a playlist he'd built himself from his father's record collection, and a few things he loved on his own. It had been a good day. He believed for a long time afterward that they had been well matched. He had been wrong, or she had changed, or both things were true simultaneously, which was often how it went. The first indication that something had shifted was small enough to dismiss. A phone left charging in the bathroom instead of on the nightstand. Then a name that came up in conversation once, and then carefully never again. Then, one Tuesday evening in October, an unfamiliar car parked 2 houses down that she drove away in 20 minutes after telling him she was going to the pharmacy. He had not followed. He had noted it. He was his father's son. He knew how to read a torque spec. He knew you measured first. The man's name was Creighton Farr. Ezra learned this not through any dramatic revelation, but through the ordinary patience of paying attention. He had seen the car a second time, a burgundy sedan, late model, Memphis plates, and he had noted the partial plate on the third sighting and run it through a contact he trusted, a retired investigator named Herbert Glass, who had done work for the company on 2 insurance matters and who charged a flat rate and kept his findings brief. Herbert's findings were not brief, as it turned out. They were specific and unhurried, delivered in a folder that Herbert slid across a workbench in the back of the shop on a Wednesday morning while Ezra's guys were running equipment in the front bay. Creighton Farr was 43, worked in commercial real estate, and had the kind of public profile that was designed to look impressive from a distance. A leased office suite on Peabody Place, a personal LinkedIn with carefully chosen photographs, an event page from a charity gala where he appeared with a wide smile next to people whose names carried weight in Memphis. He drove the burgundy sedan on weekdays and a newer truck on weekends, which he appeared to own outright, financed through a credit union in Cordova. Herbert had also pulled public records because Herbert was thorough, and the public records told a quieter story. 2 civil judgments in the last 6 years, both settled. A lapsed contractor's license from a prior business venture. A pattern of addresses that moved every 18 to 24 months, which was not by itself evidence of anything, but which Herbert noted in the way that experienced men note things that have the texture of avoidance. "He presents well," Herbert said. "Most problems do," Ezra said, "before you get inside them." He did not shake when he read the folder. He moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined him. The calm of a man who had spent years working with things that required his hands to be steady even when his mind was working hard. He photographed the relevant pages with his phone, forwarded them to his own email, and closed the folder. He opened a new notes file on his phone. He named it simply FAR. He made one call, to his brother Dion. "I need you to come by the shop Saturday morning," he said, "early." Dion did not ask why. He knew his brother well enough to know that when Ezra said early, he meant before the day had a chance to complicate itself. It was 3 days after that call that Creighton Farr pulled up to the house on a Saturday morning while Ezra was on the porch with coffee, and laughed at the truck. He laughed with the ease of a man who had no awareness of being observed. He said something to Simone, low, amused, the register of a private joke between people who have developed the habit of small cruelties. And Simone looked at the driveway and not at Ezra, which was its own answer. Ezra watched all of this from the porch. He took one long sip of coffee. He set the mug on the railing. His face remained perfectly calm. He went inside. He picked up his phone and called his company's attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had handled Beaumont Fabrications' legal affairs for 6 years, and who, when Ezra had laid out the situation 2 days prior in a preliminary call, had said exactly 4 words before he'd finished explaining. "Document everything. Stop nothing." He had done both. Patricia Osei's office was on the 9th floor of a building in downtown Memphis, and she ran her practice with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the things people did to each other when they believed they were invisible. She was 51, had the kind of precise, unhurried speaking manner that courtrooms rewarded, and she had reviewed everything Ezra brought her: Herbert's folder, the joint account statements, a photograph of the burgundy sedan in the driveway taken by the doorbell camera Ezra had installed 18 months ago for unrelated reasons, and a printed summary of Beaumont Fabrications' current financial position, with the expression of a woman assembling a picture she had already half anticipated. "She has no ownership stake in the company," Patricia said. It was not a question. "None," Ezra said. "The company transferred to me and Dion through my father's estate. Simone was never a party to any of it." "And the house?" "Purchased before the marriage. My name only on the deed." Patricia made a note. "Tennessee is an equitable distribution state, not community property. Premarital assets, kept separate and undocumented as shared, are typically protected. The house is clean, the company is clean." She paused. "What she may have a claim on is any appreciation in value of marital assets accumulated during the marriage. The joint account, certain personal property." "The joint account has $4,200 in it," Ezra said. "I moved everything else 18 months ago, after my father died, into accounts held under the business umbrella. I did it for estate planning reasons. My CPA documented the rationale at the time." Patricia looked at him for a moment. That was well done. My father was a precise man, Ezra said. He taught me to think about the end of a job before you start it. Preparation was the work. Dion came to the shop that same Saturday he'd been called, before Creighton Farr had made his appearance at the house, and while Ezra was still moving on information rather than confirmed knowledge. Dion was 41, ran the estimating side of the business, and had the quality, shared by certain oldest siblings, of arriving at a situation already knowing more than he let on. He sat on a stool in the back bay while Ezra talked, and when Ezra finished, Dion was quiet for a full 30 seconds, in the way their father used to be quiet before he said something worth hearing. You remember what Dad used to say when a piece came in that looked good on the outside but you weren't sure about the frame? Dion said. Put it on the lift, Ezra said. Put it on the lift, Dion said. You don't know what something's built on until you put it on the lift. They sat with that for a moment. The shop hummed around them. There's something else, Dion said. He slid a piece of paper across the workbench. It was a printed email thread, forwarded from a business contact of Dion's, who worked in commercial real estate on the east side of the city. Creighton Farr, it appeared, had been circulating feelers about a possible business partnership, the kind of arrangement that involved bringing in an investor for a commercial property deal in exchange for a share of the equity. He had been describing his access to a fabrication and restoration business with significant commercial contracts and family-connected assets in Memphis as a credential for why he was worth bringing in. He had used the name Beaumont. Ezra read the email twice. His hands did not shake. He doesn't own any piece of this company, Ezra said. No, Dion said, he does not. And he's been representing that he does. That's what it looks like. Ezra folded the paper carefully. He added it to the folder he was building in the same back office cabinet where his father had always kept the company's foundational documents. Original incorporation papers, the first commercial contract, the photograph of Raymond Beaumont standing in front of the F-100 the day the restoration was complete, 1987, the year Ezra was born. He paused for a moment in front of that photograph. He turned off the light. He went to handle the rest of the day. The following Wednesday, Patricia Osei filed a cease and desist with Creighton Farr's business address, detailing the misrepresentation of affiliation with Beaumont Fabrication and Restoration, and the unauthorized use of its name and assets as credentials in commercial solicitation. She copied the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, with whom Farr held a license. She copied the Memphis Business Journal's editorial tip line as a professional courtesy to the public record. She had, she told Ezra calmly when she called to inform him, also preserved the email thread and Herbert's folder in a formal evidence package should additional filings become necessary. What kind of additional filings? Ezra asked. The kind that come after divorce proceedings begin, she said, when the other party realizes the landscape is not what they assumed. Ezra did not smile. He thanked her and hung up. That evening he came home and cooked dinner. He made smothered pork chops, which had been his father's recipe, and he set the table for two. Simone came in from wherever she had been and asked what the occasion was. He said there was no occasion. He said he just felt like cooking. They ate. She talked. He listened. He refilled her water glass without being asked. He was watching. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the cease and desist. Ezra had not engineered it to happen on that particular day. He had simply been ready. And Thursday happened to be the day Simone came home with the energy of someone who had just received news and had not yet decided how to use it. She started it. She said she thought they needed to talk about the direction of their marriage. He let her talk. She said she felt like they had grown in different directions. She said she needed more than what the life they had built together was giving her. She said she had been thinking about this for a long time. She did not mention Creighton Farr by name. When she finished, Ezra set down his glass. "Simone," he said, "before you go further with this, there are some things I think you should know." He placed 3 documents on the kitchen table. The first was a copy of the cease and desist that Patricia O'Shea had filed, which had been served to Creighton Farr's office address, and which Ezra had confirmed, via delivery receipt, had been received and signed for. The second was the email thread in which Farr had represented his access to the Beaumont Company name and assets in a commercial solicitation. The third was a summary, prepared by Patricia, of the financial landscape of any potential divorce proceeding, the premarital assets, the business structure, the account arrangements, the legal standing of each. Simone looked at the documents without touching them. "He told you he had a connection to my father's company," Ezra said, his voice even and unhurried. "He does not. He never did. What he has done in the state of Tennessee is misrepresent a business affiliation in commercial solicitation, which is a matter the Real Estate Commission is currently reviewing." He paused. "He also may have led you to believe he had resources and standing that are not precisely what they appear." Simone was quiet. She was very still. "I'm not angry," Ezra said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not angry. But I need you to understand what you are actually looking at, because I don't think anyone has shown it to you plainly." She looked at the table. She looked at the documents she had not touched. She said quietly, "The truck." He laughed at the truck. "He did," Ezra said, "and you were on the porch." "I was on the porch," he said. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. Then she said, "What did your father build it from?" "Bare metal," Ezra said. 1967. Took him 20 years to find the right parts. Finished it the year I was born." He looked toward the window where, outside, the F-100 sat in the driveway where it had always sat. "That truck paid for this house. It paid for the first contract. It paid for every person who works at the shop and every one of their families." He was quiet. A man who can't see past the surface of a thing will always misread what he's looking at. He stood. He gathered the documents. He left one copy on the table for her. "Patricia O'Shea's number is on the last page," he said. "You should have your own attorney. I want this to be done correctly." He walked out the front door. He got in the F-100. He let it idle for a moment, the way it always did, the engine settling into its particular low register, a sound that had been part of the background of his entire life. He drove. 10 months later, Ezra was in the back bay of the shop on a Saturday morning, working on a 1971 Chevrolet C10 that a client in Germantown had brought in for a full frame-off restoration. The truck had good bones. It had been neglected, not abused, which was a distinction that mattered. Neglect was recoverable if you had the patience and the knowledge and the willingness to start at the beginning and not skip anything. He had all 3. The divorce had been finalized in the spring, processed through Patricia O'Shea with the calm efficiency of a transaction whose terms had been clear from the moment the assets were examined. Simone had retained her own attorney, as Ezra had suggested, and that attorney had reviewed the financial landscape and advised his client accordingly. There was no battle over the house, which was Ezra's alone. There was no claim against the company, which had never touched the marriage in any legally actionable way. There was a division of personal property, handled in a single afternoon without raised voices. because Ezra had not come to raise his voice. Creighton Farr's real estate license had been suspended for 60 days pending the Commission's review of the misrepresentation complaint. The commercial deal he had been circulating had collapsed when the prospective partners did their own due diligence and found the Beaumont name was not available for his use. He had moved offices once since the cease and desist. Herbert Glass mentioned in passing that the burgundy sedan had been repossessed in August. Ezra registered all of this through the same third-party channels through which it arrived. He noted it. He moved on. A woman named Lorraine had come into the picture in the way that things came into Ezra's picture, gradually, without performance, because of sustained proximity to something real. She was a mechanical engineer who had come to the shop to consult on a client project, had asked better questions than most people asked, and had come back the following week on an unrelated matter, or at least a pretext for one. She was precise and unhurried, and interested in the actual answers to her actual questions, which Ezra found more appealing at 37 than he would have known to look for at 29. She was in the front office now, working on something, visible through the window that separated the office from the bay. Dion appeared in the bay doorway with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without asking. They stood together looking at the C-10, the way men who have worked together a long time stand and look at a job in progress. Not with impatience, with assessment. "Dad would have liked this one," Dion said. "He would have," Ezra said. The F-100 was parked in its usual place just outside the bay door, in the spot that had been its spot for 11 years. The morning light came across it at a low angle and caught the metalwork in a way that reminded you, if you were paying attention, that it had once been built from nothing by a man with good hands and a clear idea of what he was making. Ezra drank his coffee and looked at the truck and thought about his father, the way he often did on Saturday mornings, and found that the thinking did not hurt the way it once had. What remained was simpler, steadier. Tools were meant to work, not shine. He set down his cup and got back to work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.